Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thanks to Pam for organizing this. As always, she is too sweet to turn down, right? If she asked you to do anything, you would do it. But I'm happy to do this. Meshach Browning and the Browning family has been of interest to me. So full disclaimer, I am not in any way related or a descendant of the Browning family that I know of. But their descendancy certainly reaches far and wide. So probably everyone's in some way related to them in some aspect or another. So what we're going to talk about tonight is the life and times of Meshach and Mary Browning. I think Meshach gets the headline a lot of times, but I think we need to give some time to Mary, his wife. He actually had two wives named Mary, but we'll talk about that. And we're going to talk generally more about life in the Glades, which is the central part of what would become Garrett County during the pioneer area of the early 1800s. So, while I'm going to talk about a lot about Meshach and his stories, we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the contemporaries of their family while they were there in the early 1800s. There's actually a lot of prime sources about what life was like there, and kind of talk about their legacy. So what they've left behind and ways that you can learn and interact more with the history that they've left. So like I said, we'll start with that standard bio, just the facts, ma'am type thing of when things happened, who the people were. We'll look at some maps to give you a little more orientation as to what area we're talking about. Thank you by the way, for inviting one of the south of the Mason-Dixon line people up to Pennsylvania. I'm always happy to come up here. But we're all kind of part of this Laurel Highlands area, and there just happen to be some arbitrary lines that divide us. But we all kind of share this geography and lifestyle and this Highlands attitude. So I think that kind of brings us all together. And I think a lot of the things we'll talk about tonight are going to be common themes for whether you're in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, or us Marylanders. So we'll look at those maps, and then we will talk, I'm going to talk about and bring up some of the quotations from Meshach's book. But I don't want this to be a book report. So I imagine many, if not everyone, has read the book, his book, 44 Years, The Life of a Hunter. It's we'll talk about reading it, and it's a good, interesting read, but I don't want to just go through all the things from the book. We're going to pull out some interesting highlights, but what I want to do is give more of a context and a flavor of what life was like back then. So like I said, we'll talk a little bit more about Mary and what her life must have been like. Hear those contemporary accounts. There are actually a lot of people who were his neighbors, quote unquote, at that time period, and then talk about what they've left behind and the things that we can see today to kind of get back in touch with their story. So here's the facts. Meshach was born in 1781, son of Joshua and Nancy Browning. His first wife was Mary McMullen, who he married her in 1799, and she died in 1839. He married his second wife, another Mary, who was a widow in Cumberland, Maryland. And this was a later in life marriage, and there were no children from that. But from his first wife, Mary, they had 11 children. And you can see them all here in this little family tree there. Many children, not too uncommon for that time of that period, but still a fairly big family. And Meshach died in Johnstown, not Pennsylvania, Allegheny County, which became Garrett County. So generally, Johnstown was never an incorporated town. It's more of a community at Hoy's Run Road and what's Maryland 42 right now. So there, if you're familiar with where his grave is, it's generally where that's where the community of Johnstown was. And he's buried at that cemetery there, right along Route 42. And you can see all the list of all those children, and that's why pretty much anyone who's in Garrett County or the greater area is some descendant of Meshach Browning, because they had children, they had grandchildren, they had great-grandchildren, and many of them stayed in the area and lived kind of storied lives and became leading citizens of the area as well. So Browning is still a very familiar name in the area, and many of the other connected family names are as well. Little more detail. So Joshua Browning, Meshach's father, was a British soldier who survived, and some accounts say he was a deserter from Braddock's campaign, and That's not a lot to, you can't blame the guy. The Braddock campaign was a huge disaster. They were essentially massacred, limped back to Fort Cumberland from Fort Duquesne. So whether he deserted or whether the military structure just disintegrated is up for debate. But Joshua Browning survived that, but barely survived the birth of his first son, Meshach. He died just a few weeks after Meshach was born. That was in Damascus, Maryland. So down, as we up here in the mountains call downstate in some derogatory terms. But they were born downstate. But Nancy, his mother, moved Meshach up to what was Allegheny County, and they moved around a little bit. He took some exploratory trips up to, I think he made it as far as Wheeling as a youth, kind of moved back down, but generally stayed with his aunt and uncle, the Spurgeons. But he was restless and he was ready to get on with his life. So at the age of 18, he married Mary McMullen of the Blooming Rose area. So that's generally an area around Friendsville, Maryland. And the McMullens were, a fairly well-established, well-to-do family in that area. And Mary's father was not a fan of this marriage. She saw that Meshach was a man of little means. He had already somewhat established himself as a hunter, but, didn't really bring a lot to this marriage. So Mary's father was skeptical that Meshach was going to really be able to provide for Mary. And that, that's a common theme, right? There's just no son-in-law who's good enough for your daughter. So I think Meshach eventually won him over, but there was some rough years for when he was trying to prove himself to Mary's father. But they very quickly gave birth to their first child named Dorcas and went on to have 10 more children, as we said, and Meshach's considered to be one of the greatest hunter in Maryland's history. His estimate, and I don't think this is outlandish, was 1,800 to 2,000 deer, 300 to 400 bear, about 50 panthers and catamounts, and scores of wolves and wildcats. So the deer and the bear were mainly for subsistence hunting and survival and selling that meat, to get money to, build things at their homestead. Panthers were more just pest control. They would kill any livestock. And wolves there was a bounty. There was a countywide bounty, state paid bounty for any wolf scalps that were brought in. So he hunted those for money. Once Meshach and Mary left Blooming Rose area, they settled in a variety of homesteads. They settled in some abandoned cabins until they finally settled down around Sang Run, that area. And he eventually built a full homestead there with 200 acres, a mill, which he eventually turned over to his son. So he became more of a man of means and respectable community member as he progressed through a lot of hard work and the support of his family. Unfortunately, in around 1836, Mary was thrown from a horse and she was severely injured. She remained bedbound for the next 3 years or so, and she finally passed away in 1839. So as the custom was, it's kind of just not customary for a man to not be married at that point. He found a widow, another Mary down in Cumberland, married her, moved her up to the Sang Run homestead, and they continued to maintain a house until she passed away in 1857. And then he lasted until 1859, reportedly hunting until very, very soon until his death. And he's buried with both of those wives at that cemetery along Maryland Route 42. And you can see the picture here of his original homestead along Sang Run that was taken by Leo Beachy. And that was taken in the early 1900s when it was still standing. It has been since torn down. But you get a sense of what the size and style of those cabins were. They weren't big, but they were sturdy and they had everything that they needed there. So why do we care? Why am I doing this presentation? Why was I so interested in Meshach Browning? He wrote this book, fairly sizable book, 44 Years of the Life of a Hunter. And, if you haven't read it, it's a lot of hunting tales. It's, 44 years of hunting stories. And some of them may strain your ability to believe in them. But interspersed with all of that is a lot of great accounts of what everyday life was like back in the early 1800s, what it was like to survive, what the family structures were like. The whole account of him and his father-in-law is timeless. But it's interesting to see that was, still playing out back in those days. What's also great about this is there are also a number of other primary accounts that we'll talk about that coincide that, he was quote unquote neighbors, even though they were probably 5 or 6 miles away, with a lot of other people who were writing about this area and what life was like. And it's interesting to see how they line up and how they compare with each other, and whether they really knew each other or not. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. In 1859, so shortly after the book 44 Years of Life of the Hunter was published, the Atlantic magazine wrote a fairly long 2-page review of the book, and they found value in it. They said, "We learn how much a sound stomach has to do with human felicity, that a bride may make her husband happy though her whole outfit consists of 2 cups and saucers, 2 knives and forks, and 2 spoons. That a man may be hospitable in a cabin 12 by 15 with only the forest for his larder, and that an American needs only an axe and a rifle for his start in life." So even in 1859, there was still that kind of nostalgia for what life was, getting back to the land and getting back to nature and leaving behind, all the unimportant stuff of industrialized society. And, all you really need is that axe and rifle to, start your life. So they did recognize that the value of telling his story, but they did think that the book should have been shorter by at least 2/3, because one Barry story is just like another. So certainly, there's a lot of value, and it's, you got to kind of take the good with the bad in that book. So now we're going to kind of step back a little bit and see how the Brownings got to where they were. So going back, way back, the time you usually talk about is time immemorial. So when the indigenous peoples lived in this land, they were originally settled and traversed by a lot of tribes and groups of people, the Massawomic, Monongahela culture, Shawnee Indian tribe. So other people who were kind of driven out by the kind of the push of the European settlers starting in the 1700s. And really, especially in Garrett County, there don't seem to be any permanent settlements of indigenous people. So they seem to be more seasonal settlements along riverbanks, river valleys, that they would hunt and gather during those times when the weather was good, and then kind of move on to more favorable living conditions during the winter seasons. But this map shows the green triangles are either places where there are archaeological evidence of indigenous people settlements, or very strong suspicions that they were there. And the red shows that the red shows the trails that they likely had. And you can see some interesting stuff of, we've got what would be Route 40 there, coming along the northern part of the county. You see, some of these trails kind of coming along here through the south, and largely they follow current day roads, because we're all creatures of habit. We all take the path of least resistance. So it makes sense that our modern day roads probably followed what the indigenous people's trails and paths were. But like I said, they really didn't leave a big imprint on this area. Really, we only have, in Garrett County anyway, just 2 names that are from indigenous peoples of the Potomac and Youghiogheny rivers. Many other places on the East Coast have lots of these names, and they really just didn't have a lot of presence here. So moving on to when the Europeans started to kind of push into this area. This is a detail from a 1755 map. And Thomas Jefferson's father, Peter Jefferson, was actually one of the publishers and main authors of this map. So it's pretty good. It's not perfect. We've got some interesting things going on here. So we see, of course, Garrett County here. We see what would become the National Road along here. But Fort Necessity is wildly out of place. It should be right up here. So they didn't quite get that right. And really, they have some general details of what was in Garrett County, kind of one big mountain range, and the Youghiogheny, which isn't labeled, and some other tributaries of what they were calling at the time the Cohongoronto River. So I'm a little disappointed that they didn't keep that name. It's a pretty cool name, but I'm glad because in elementary school I'd never be able to spell it. But things change over time. And one of the other things I love about this map is I think they just gave up here and they just said we're not going any further. There's too many laurel thickets and we can't make it. But you see the challenge of mapping this area, especially. We've got mountains, we've got rivers, and laurel thickets to get through. And really, it was still fairly, almost completely unsettled at this point, and still largely the frontier. Fort Cumberland was really the last bastion of civilization going west along that particular route. But the Revolutionary War happened, and there was a strong desire to start settling this new country and states that had been gained independence, because you start settling stuff, you get tax dollars from that. So the state of Maryland's incentive was to get all these Revolutionary War soldiers out to the hinterlands, producing stuff and paying taxes. So part of that incentive was to divide up all this new land into 50-acre lots and award them to Revolutionary War soldiers as part of the payment for their service. And that way you don't have to pay them actual money too. So in 1777, the Maryland General Assembly passed the act to pay these soldiers, and every effective recruit is to receive, besides the continental allowances, a bounty of $40, a pair of shoes, a pair of stockings, and at the expiration of their term, provided that he shall not desert from the army, 50 acres of land to be procured and laid off as aforesaid to him or his representative. So on the left is the full map of what would become Garrett County, with all of those 50-acre lots meticulously metered out there. And then in the middle, you can see what I've superimposed, what's now Deep Creek Lake, on top of that. So you can see there was already some of these lots, or some of this land, that was already patented or taken by settlers before they did this. But for the large majority of them, they had these military lots set out. What's interesting is that there's not really a lot of evidence that anyone actually came and settled their lot. Every lot that we've been able to track back has indicated that the soldiers sold their lot to speculators and then settled somewhere else. But if you track back pretty much any piece of land in Garrett County, you can track it back to one of these military lots typically. And then on the right shows the kind of population density of what would become the U.S. right after the Revolutionary War. So you can see our area has got that least shading, and that was, I didn't make it big enough, but that's 2 to 15 people per square mile. So not a lot, and probably in Garrett County even fewer than that, because it's inaccessible, it's difficult to get through, and you really have to work to, provide a living on some of that land. But they made it here, and once you kind of found the good spots, there was a lot of bounty here. And we're going to talk a lot about the glades, and that's kind of a general definition of the central area of what would become Garrett County. And Meshach Browning's definition from his book was, this delightful valley lies between the Great Backbone Mountain and the western hills of the Youghiogheny River, covers an area of 10 or 12 miles. The mountain commences at the Savage River, one of the tributaries of the Potomac, and runs from northeast to southwest, while Hoophole Ridge begins at the narrows of Deep Creek and runs nearly parallel with the backbone. The glades are, or were then, clear, level meadows covered with high grass, which was altogether different from what is produced now, being of a much better character, growing nearly as high as rye, with a blue tassel at the top. So especially the last sentence of that quotation is, even during his lifetime, Meshach was noting the transition of the wildlands and kind of the change that settlement was impacting. So, we all feel that, right? We're all just like, no more people, stop. I want it exactly as I got, when I got here. And even, in his time, he was seeing that people were coming and, pasturing cattle in these glades areas, and kind of, in his mind, ruining the natural grasses there. They were, maybe replanting things that grew faster and better for the cattle to eat, but weren't as beautiful as what was already there previously. So let's look at the Maryland that Meshach kind of got to. This map is from 1838. It's a detail of a state map from the state of Maryland. And I've marked some of the spots of things that he mentioned in his book specifically. So that first one, that number one in that map, is that Hoop Hole Ridge that he mentions in that quote previously. And there's another quote that he has about, viewing over, if you look over Hoop Hole Ridge, now you would see much of Deep Creek Lake, but you would at that point see waving, fields of grass and deer playing in the distance. So it's a very idyllic scene that he describes as the view from Hoop Hole Ridge. So that's kind of central to Garrett County. Most of the rest of the county, though, especially the southern part, was largely unoccupied. And we have that issue there of, we have the national road that went along the northern stretch of Garrett County, but really no access. You have what would become Route 50 kind of cutting through the southern corner, but it was still very difficult to access the southern part and the central part of Garrett County because of the mountains and the rivers. So he identified the head of the North Branch of the Potomac was the greatest wilderness that they were acquainted with at that time. So that southern point of Garrett County was complete wilderness to him. So that must mean a lot if it was wilderness to him. Interestingly, the only city, town mentioned on this map is the only town that he specifically mentions doing anything in Garrett County, which is Selbysport. Of course, Selbysport was flooded by the Youghiogheny River Lake, but that was kind of the population center at that time due to its, kind of where it was and the location of current routes at that time. But the rest of the southern county, so if you're a Garrett County person, Oakland is what normally comes to mind as the main town in Garrett County. That was barely even a settlement at that point because the railroad had not come through and not provided a population method for the southern part of the county. And then those 4 and 5 on the map show the general locations of his homesteads that he lived at during his, the time that he wrote the book. So number 4 was the one in the Glades, and number 5, he was kind of the permanent one that they built along the Sangamon River. And this map is from 1901, so well past his time, but it gives you a good topographical view of this, the area of the Glades and kind of this central area of Garrett County. You can kind of see Deep Creek, which you can kind of see what would become the lake here. And you can see it was kind of a marshy, swampy area in this part of the lake. You can see, what will become the town of McHenry there, the Youghiogheny River. And, what's interesting from this map are kind of all of the mountains and the terrain you would have to cross up and down to get anywhere. And that kind of shows, why this was so lightly settled at that point. Okay, so now we're going to get into some of these, quotes and snippets of what everyday life was like for Meshach and Mary back then. So the early settlers, being but few in number, had a hard time to maintain themselves. Had they not used the greatest economy, they could not live in the wilderness at all. All the settlers lived in cabins and fed their children on bread, meat, butter, honey, and milk. Coffee and tea were almost out of the question. And that really, provides a good snapshot. They ate everything they ate was, harvested from the land. Likely the only things that were manufactured that they used were the rifle and balls and powder that he hunted with, but everything was handmade, all the clothes, all the food. And this picture, so his book is well illustrated by the publisher of the book, E. Stabler. And there's a lot of these engravings that kind of give you these nice little snapshots of what life was like. So one of the really good descriptions of their life in the Glades, in that central part of Garrett County, was clearing the land and killing rattlesnakes by the score. So they just went out with clubs, kind of swished through the grass. When the rattlesnakes would come out, they'd club them and get them out of their area. So they had horses, they had livestock, they had to just get rid of all these snakes. And apparently the area was infested with them. But let's get to hunting. This was Meshach's primary pastime and way to support his family. But it's clear that he really had a deep respect for the wildlife. So he says, presently a tremendous buck appeared. I thought to kill him would be to destroy a fine animal to no purpose, and I determined not to shoot him as I knew he would be not fit for use. So clearly he enjoyed the sport of hunting. He certainly didn't have any qualms about killing animals, but at the same time, when there was no reason to do it, even if there was probably an amazing trophy, he didn't shoot the deer. And he had that respect and knowledge of the natural surroundings. And his if nothing else, his book shows just some great hunting techniques and some abilities to connect with nature and understand your prey, so that you can, better harvest it. And one especially, we'll talk about a couple more hunting stories, but one especially crazy story is he talks about wrestling a wounded deer in the Youghiogheny River, and he'd gotten into this situation where he couldn't let the deer go, but he was having to wrestle with it with its antlers, in order so it didn't spear him or club him or push him under the water. And he eventually just wore the animal out, and it eventually went under the water. But a famed illustrator of the Adirondacks, A.F. Tate, was so inspired by this story, he created this illustration, this color illustration, that went on to get published in a number of like the Atlantic Monthly and New York Times and that kind of thing. So it's kind of one of those things where it's one of those things of the story is so outlandish, could have even made it up. And you kind of think, well, some of these things may be ridiculous, but some of them are probably have a lot of grains of truth in them. So not only did they survive on what he hunted and what they gathered from the land, but he also used those products to trade with. So here he's talking about a trade trip that he took to what we call downstate. He said, I collected all my venison, a respectable load of fine, fat, and fresh deer meat. I had 87 saddles of venison and 3 whole deer. I also had with me 7 saddles of bear meat, together with butter, beeswax, and furs of different kind. At Hagerstown, I met with a ready sale, and in Frederick City, we disposed of over $80 worth, all for cash, at 12.5 cents per pound. We then went to Georgetown, where we sold out without trouble. By this means, I raised money, paid for my land, and had something left to work for the family, besides being able to hire a hand in a pinch of work. So even back then, the city people were like looking for the fresh, quality, wholesome food from the mountains. So again, there's still that desire to kind of connect back with nature and get back to the roots and get back away from the processed stuff that we're all kind of fed daily. And here's a nice shot of one of those illustrations from the book of a typical hunting camp. So this one is on Meadow Mountain, where they had hunted a bear and were kind of then hanging out and by the fire after the bear hunt. So I promised a little bit about Mary McMullen Browning, and it's what's unfortunate, as you see in the family tree diagram, is that both of his wives didn't get portraits and one of his daughters didn't. And it's kind of there was a hand-drawn portrait of him. Meshach throughout the book exclaims how beautiful Mary is. So it's too bad that she didn't warrant getting her own portrait. And it kind of says the value of what women were thought of. They were definitely there to keep the home and take care of the kids, but maybe they didn't quite warrant a portrait. But the publisher and editor of the book had high praise for Mary. E. Stabler said that it may be truly said of this inestimable lady, Mary Browning, that though reared in the wilderness, every trait that adorns the female character shone brightly in her. She was a dutiful child, a most exemplary mother, a devoted wife, and a true friend. So, Meshach clearly loved Mary too, but didn't necessarily devote a lot of attention to her in the book. It was kind of just taken for granted that she would take care of the family, she'd take care of the kids, but kind of doesn't get a lot of the limelight. So we're hoping that, we can kind of bring that story a little more to the forefront and talk about what women's life was like back then. And it probably wasn't easy. So this is one of Meshach's quotes. He says, I have often thought what some of our young ladies of these days would do if placed in a like situation, particularly our city girls, if at 20 years of age, for that was the age of Mary, when they were located among bears, panthers, wolves, and rattlesnakes. And what would they do? I would like to see a few of them tried, just to learn how they would come through what she so bravely stood up to. So she, definitely came forward and stood up and was a true pioneer mountain woman. But it must have been a fairly dreary life. There were a lot of monotonous, uh, heavy labor that she had to do. She was raising 11 kids. And in this picture shows kind of what her life must have been like, was tied to that hearth, cooking meals and making candles. And so a lot of that drudgery work was left to her, while Meshach, while he was out supporting the family and hunting, he clearly enjoyed that part. So she was often left behind to kind of take care of all that and make sure that the family was running while he was out, doing his thing. So let's talk a little bit about some of these contemporary accounts. So there's a lot of people. There's not a lot of people, but most of them have some sort of a contemporary account of what life was like in the Glades. So many of his neighbors either wrote about what their life was like or had people who visited them that wrote about what life was like in this period. So Colonel James McHenry, very famous namesake of Fort McHenry in Baltimore and also the community of McHenry in Maryland. And he was one of the early, I wouldn't say quite settler, but purchaser and homesteader around the Glades. He certainly had more means to buy land and hire help and build buildings than Meshach did. But he came and really established a community. And they bought a lot of land, but they built a lot of infrastructure and kind of created that community that McHenry kind of grew around past him. So there's one good quote from him, but mainly his nephew, John McHenry Esquire, continued to live there and really provide a lot more of those first-hand accounts that we'll be looking from. But Colonel McHenry really has this amazing quote that I think should be on the cover of every tourism guide for Garrett County. He's writing this letter to Thomas Johnson, the governor of Maryland at the time. And he's extolling the value of what would become Garrett County. He said, "I like this country, its salubrious air, its mild summers, its interesting views made up of hills, woods, glades, streams, and mountains. Above all, it delights me as affording at my time of life a salutary retirement from the busy world and its cares. I do not feel therefore disposed to wander farther or quit it in a hurry. Indeed, did it quadrate with the interest of the whole of my family to fix here, I should never move from the spot I am on now." So, I think we're all here and we're probably all not going here. And I think a lot of that is why, what keeps us here, what brings us to this type of area is the hills, the woods, the weather, all of those fabulous things. From his nephew, John McHenry, are some interesting little snippets of kind of what the fishing was like and some more about the attitude of this area. Deep Creek, which would become Deep Creek Lake, was a big landmark. So a lot of people talked about it in a lot of these letters, and we'll see it was of a special interest to some development plans. But he's talking about Deep Creek has become a famous trout fishery. 2 parties came over this summer from beyond Laurel Hill to fish in it, besides parties from Selbysport and the neighboring county in Virginia, which would become West Virginia. 4 were fishing 3 days and with hook and line caught more than 700 trout. Some other parties caught 600 and some more. So they're just pulling trout out of these rivers with very little effort. And we'll kind of see that has an impact later on. These inexhaustible resources that seemed to them at the time weren't so inexhaustible, and you had to kind of come back and restore the natural equilibrium. But at this time, it was just a free-for-all of pulling out 700 trout in a couple days. John McHenry also says, "I know of no other country suited than this for such a change, a country not obnoxious to the unwholesome damps and vapors of thick forests, river bottoms, but a continued suite of glades, with a perspective through groves of white oaks from one glade to another, each presenting a variety of prospect of hills and valleys. And throughout each valley flows a stream of pure spring water in a deep, narrow channel, which freshens the air through which the summer season always keeps cool. A country almost unoccupied, no peculiar customs, prejudices, or manners, then a new settler is obliged to accommodate himself to accept treating the original settlers with kindness and civility. So another great kind of description of our area and what makes it so special. So those were the McHenrys, and there's a lot of great letters of theirs that are collected that have a lot of these similar type of recollections. The next contemporary account that we'll look at is James Shriver, and he was surveying an extension to the C&O Canal. So at this time, the early 1800s, there was considerable interest at the the federal national level of extending the C&O Canal past Cumberland to eventually connect to the Ohio River. And this would have created a trade route that could have potentially flown from the Atlantic Ocean, through Baltimore, all the way, or through D.C., all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, and conceivably all the way around. So there's a lot of interest in that trade route. Canals were the kind of the main method of transportation. This was before the advent of railroads, and they wanted to see if this was possible. James Shriver was the engineer who was commissioned to try and find this proposed route. How feasible would it be to continue the C&O Canal past Cumberland and eventually somehow connect to the Ohio River? As it turns out to be extremely improbable to do that, but he nevertheless did a very detailed survey of what this potential course may be. So this is, you can't quite see any detail, but that yellow circle, Browning's mill, Browning's homestead, is actually located on that map. So he did a very detailed survey, talked to all of the neighbors, all of the people who were there at the time. And this detail really shows some interesting aspects of what was there at the time. So you can see the McHenry family homestead there. I've kind of superimposed the black. Those are the roads that were there. The yellow highlighted is the course of Deep Creek at the time. And you can see there was a bridge over Deep Creek. There were falls of Deep Creek, which you can now rediscover today. So there was a lot of interesting detail from his survey of what the area was like back then. And he talks about what Deep Creek was like. And I won't go through this full one, but he said that, receives a volume of water 25 by 3 feet, an open glade of 1 mile in length occurs, and it also gets a general inundation. So in the summer or the spring and into the summer, this whole area would get flooded, become very swampy, and kind of maybe the origin of the glades nomenclature for this area. Shriver also indicates that there was a remarkable spring near the residence of John McHenry, and its water seemed to issue a considerable depth through fissures of rock, bringing its current perfectly white and beautiful sand, and the ebullition is produced, which strongly resembles boiling. So there was a boiling springs in McHenry, which has been since covered by the lake. But these are the kind of interesting little details that you kind of get from all of these contemporary accounts of this this area. And what's interesting in Browning's book, he mentions that he meets Shriver a few years later when Browning is actually in Annapolis, and they run into each other. And Shriver says, "Oh yes, we met in when I was doing this survey in Allegheny, what would become Garrett County." And Meshach just says, "I didn't remember him." So it's kind of remarkable that this guy, Outlander, came in, was doing a lot of surveying and inquiring, and Meshach just didn't remember that he was even there. But a lot of these accounts kind of line up, and you see a little bit of mention of each other in them, but it really does belie the fact that many of these communities were just very isolated. People had very little interaction with each other, and it was very much your family and what you were doing to survive day to day. And the last contemporary account we'll talk about is F.G. Skinner. And he was an outdoorsman, a writer for what was at the time a very big outdoor magazine. He visited a Scotsman named Campbell. And if you look back on Shriver's map, you can see where Campbell's spot was, kind of a little bit north of the Glades. But Skinner, traveled around and wrote travel logs. He was kind of one of the original bloggers before there were blogs, when blogs were books. And he was an enthusiastic hunter, and he found great success in the glades. He talks about Deep Creek and talks about, where you can, a fowler, a duck hunter, can approach the stream anywhere perfectly masked from the vigilant ducks, and so with half range of a number 6 shot. So this was a great area for duck hunting because you could get in the grasses and get right up to where the ducks were and shoot them, before they were aware of your presence. And this is a great quote. He talks about he was an original foodie as well. So a lot of his other accounts talk about the food that he has at each places. So he's talking about a meal that he had at James McHenry's house. And he says the principal dish was jowl mounted on a mass of what has become the rarest, as is the most delicate of all brassicas, curled savory cabbage. The cook had time to supplement it with some trout, some fried and others, the largest, stuffed with butter and herbs, served in neat wrappers of white paper in which they had been cooked. I here do most positively assert that never, anywhere, at any time, have I eaten anything to compare with these fat, flaky, salmon-colored Deep Creek trout cooked in papillet. So I hope we have some of that later. I'm already pretty hungry. But again, you can kind of see the bounty of the land at this point, and the amazing stuff that this land was producing, and the desire for the city people to kind of get that wholesome food and get these delicious meals. And then a couple of Meshach stories about Deep Creek and the hunting and that kind of stuff. I won't read this whole one, but just another story about for just as fast as I could bait my hook and let it into the water, I pulled out the largest kind of trout. And just in the matter of probably a few hours, he counted 47 trout that he'd just been pulling out of the Deep Creek here at the Narrows. And he talks about fishing. So Mary, one of her particular favorites was trout for breakfast. So he gratified her by going to Deep Creek, where fishing for trout was certain. And another nice quotation about the beauty of the area. So, and if a woman's eyes were ever pleased by beholding beautiful flowers, then Mary was gratified, for she gathered many bunches and still saw new ones which she still coveted. But we would carry no more. The whole face of the country was like a beautiful sheet of wallpaper, variegated with all shades of color. So just another example of the natural beauty and bounty of the area. And one more quick hunting story of him doing what is now quite illegal. He's talking about fixing up a canoe with the manner. He has a little shutter on his lantern, and he would float down Deep Creek. There we go. He'd float down Deep Creek by candlelight, and if he saw a deer on the shore, he would open the shutter of his spotlight. The deer would freeze, and he'd shoot it. So we all know that's a big no-no nowadays, but that was one of his favorite methods of hunting along Deep Creek. And just to give you a couple more examples of some of the illustrations from the book and the hunting techniques, he used dogs. His dogs were very important partners with him in the hunt. He would use them to chase down the bear and the deer, tire them out, kind of get them to slow down so he could get a good shot. Typically, he would take a shot, wound the animal, because all we had were lead balls, so we're not talking anything that had a lot of penetrative power. So he'd probably wound the animal. The dogs would then chase it down, wear it down, and often, as he claimed, and I'm not doubting that this happened, sometimes he would finish it off with his knife. So there were some discussions of him. He has some discussions of wildly fighting a bear with his knife. I'm not sure he really did that sometimes, but certainly that would be one option where you have an animal that was severely wounded and you would have to finish it off. And then a couple more examples of the hunting techniques. In the upper right-hand corner is kind of the bears cornering, the dogs cornering a bear. In the lower right, you see a bear trap. So he would set up bear traps and get them to go in and have the lid fall, and then he could harvest them at his leisure. In the bottom left is a panther hunt. So that was kind of the typical process, is that the dogs would chase the panther, get it in a tree, and then he could kind of shoot it out of the tree once it was stuck up there. And then the upper right is that famous wrestling the buck in the Yakagani. So let's talk a little bit about his legacy, what they've left behind. But you could see that, he really had his priorities in order. He said, "Here I found my true pleasure, my wife, dressed clean, her beauty, in my estimation, unsurpassed. The children as clean as water, as soap could make them, plenty to live on, and not an enemy on earth. I say, who could be happier than I was at that time?" So just a, great sentiment of what's important in life. That book review from the Atlantic Monthly that I mentioned says that 55 years later, he had increased to 122. So his descendants had increased to 122, of whom 67, as their progenitor proudly states, were capable of bearing arms for the defense of their country. So a lot of big family, a lot of good, healthy kids that could go on and defend their country. And many people trace descendancy back to Meshach Browning and that family. It's a still very common name in the area. And still that legacy of respecting the land and valuing its bounty, I think, still lives on. So you can see here on the right, his headstone with his wives buried also there. That's along Maryland Route 42. And the historical marker across the road that needs some help, obviously, honestly, because it's starting to fall over. That's kind of a common problem, a lot of these markers, but I'm working on addressing some of those. But, so if you see that, know that somebody is at least caring, because it is starting to lean over and will eventually fall over and, need restored. But looking at another map, this is about 30 years after Browning's death. And you can kind of see there's not a lot of development, but you can see, this is the course of Deep Creek again. You can see Johnstown up here, and you see a number of little dots that indicate those that are building. So, there's actually a little town developing here at Johnstown. McHenry's got a post office now. You've got a number of post offices that are getting built throughout the county. And you see down here, this big black line, that is the B&O Railroad. So you start to see settlements along here as well. You start seeing a lot of mills. So these are sawmills or grist mills. And really, this is kind of when that industrial processing of the resources begins. So you start seeing massive timbering on a big scale. The coal mining starts to happen. And it's really when they start, kind of tapping those resources. And, now that when you see pictures of the area in the early 1900s, you see hillsides that are completely, bare of trees. You see the impacts of coal mining. So that unlimited bounty definitely runs out after a period, and you have to then kind of see what you're going to do to restore it after that happens. But what can we do to find out more and kind of get deeper into the Browning family legacy and kind of celebrate that? The Deep Creek Lake Lions Club has set up the Browning Family History Center. That's at the McHenry Community Park. If you're familiar with Garrett County, it's right next to the Heart for Animals Center. There's a great community park there. And the Lions Club has set up a bunch of interpretive panels, a bunch of pieces of art that's themed around the Browning family. And there's a trailhead for 8 miles of trails there. The Garrett County Historical Museum in Oakland, there's specifically a log cabin room there with several Browning artifacts. We'll talk a little bit about Browning's rifle at the Smithsonian. And of course, we talked about the historical marker on 42. And then the club has also set up Meshach.org, which is a website that kind of collects all this stuff. This is a collage of all those pieces of art at that Browning Family History Center. I think probably a lot of you may know Jessie there. She carved our first piece. That's a chainsaw carved sculpture of Meshach. We've got a lot of other kind of interpretations of his life and their time. So we've got a couple of cool things of Mary there. And I'll talk very briefly about this panel painting project. You can see we've got, those are all little 3D printed panels of the famous portrait of Meshach Browning. We've got that row on top that we still need to fill, and community members have all decorated and painted these. So I've got 6 of these, if anyone is interested in doing some more to kind of help us complete that top row. And all of these art projects were either created by community members or local artists. So all of these, artists that came in are, local to this area, and that's been very important for us to kind of keep it all local. The Garrett County Historical Museum in Oakland has a really great specific log cabin room, so you can see right there, and they've got a couple of really great Browning artifacts, his original portrait, and an original photo of that fair exhibit. So on the lower left is a fair exhibit that was put together in the early 1900s that showcased a lot of those Browning artifacts that I wish we were able to get our hands on today, but there you can still kind of zoom in and see some cool things there. And a contact of mine sent me these pictures of his wife, Patricia Browning Lamb. She's the one holding the rifle. This is in the armory of the Smithsonian, and they took some very detailed pictures of it. I haven't really been able to clear up whether this is something the public can make an appointment to go in and see, or if he had special connections to get in there. But regardless, it is there at the Smithsonian. It's never going to go away. They're never going to get rid of it. We've actually tried to kind of talk to them about maybe it could come back to Garrett County someday. So we're working on that. But in the meantime, it's safe. It's there. And at the very least, you can see some really detailed pictures that he took. And if anyone makes it down there and gets in, I'd love to hear about it and hear about the process to do that. Some of the online stuff we have about Meshach Browning. This is a online map. So if you're interested in going to some of the spots, I've marked those on this map. You can get to this map from meshach.org and do your own little tour of Meshach's adventures. And kind of each of those points, you click on it. It has a little quote from the book, and you can kind of get a feel for what his experience was there. So what can you do? Well, you can join your local historical society and support your lecture series. So Pam was nice enough to invite me for the first one, but there's a lot of great stuff coming up. So please continue to do that. Please join your historical societies. I think the Castle one and the Garrett County one are very reasonably priced, and they just help support the missions that these societies do. On the Deep Creek Lake Lions Club side, we are interested in acquiring and rebuilding a log cabin that's era appropriate. So I feel like someone in here has that expertise and that knowledge space. What we've really been challenged by is how we would do that. So if you're interested in maybe helping us out with that, we'd love to build that project and kind of increase the experience of that Browning family history experience. So dcllions@gmail.com, or grab them my cards on your way out. We also have a really cool event coming up on May 17th at the McHenry Community Park down there. We have a Pioneer Challenge, so it's Browning family themed. We're going to have axe throwing, water carrying, fire starting, log sawing. So it's going to be a team-based competition where you go and do these events. That's the last time we had that prize is like a live edge slab of wood with a knife kind of epoxied in there. So it's a really cool prize and just a really cool, fun experience. So May 17th is when that's happening. And I hope 6 people at least grab one of these panels on the way out and help us fill up our mosaic. So if you're interested, if you really want to dive into all this stuff, this entire presentation will be on my website, and you can grab a card from me at the end. All of those links will be live, so you can click on them and read and get all the information you want. And yeah, there's my website and my contact information. And thank you again for your interest in this, I think, really interesting topic. Thank you. So I don't know how long anyone wants to go. I think we got like 5 minutes if we want to do questions, or we want to bring out the food. If everyone's hungry. Oh well, Pam had her hand up first. Yes. How many descendants are of Meshach? Really? Wow. Okay. Well, this is definitely a Springs crowd then. So, yes, sir. He was a Protestant and then converted to Catholicism with Mary. Yeah. Yes.
I have a two-part question. So my first question for you is in the beginning of the book, when he talks about seeing buffalo and elk.
Yes.
Is that going towards, like, you're going towards the south, and you pass the McDonald's now,
Right.
and you go past, what is that? The gun center on the left-hand side.
Mm-hmm.
And you keep going a little bit, and before you get to King Run Road, back a little bit, there are some hills and mountains on the left-hand side. Is that where we saw them?
If you know, so she's asking about buffalo and elk. Buffalo Marsh was essentially where McHenry is now. So where the post office, all like the light at Mosser Road, that was that was also called Buffalo Marsh. And the legend was that when the European settlers first came in, they found dead buffalo in there that the Native Americans had pushed in, as part of like the herding and hunting. So that's generally where they were found, is that kind of central area right where McHenry is now. Elk, I think, were fairly not common, but they were kind of all around. But they were still kind of getting driven out. But I don't think there was any specific area where they found elk. But the buffalo would have been located in kind of the areas where there are more plains.
So the second part, towards the end of the book, he talks about cattle drives from Pennsylvania and Virginia, which would be present day West Virginia, coming in and like basically destroying the land. Was it around the bog, like where the key bog is now?
So your question is people coming in and destroying the land, the cattle drives, and where was that? I would say that was generally all over, but like essentially that same area we were talking about. So anywhere where there was big open plain kind of meadows, that's where you would want to put your cattle and have them grazing. And you're not going to get your cattle in the rocky hilly areas. So it's going to be that central area we were talking about, like that was around McHenry. And then if you're familiar with like more the southern part of the lake, would have been a lot of fields and meadows there that people would have been pasturing cattle in. You're welcome. Yes. No, Hoop Hole Ridge is if you're on your way to Oakland and the Little Sandies at Sand Flat Road, you're coming up that hill. That's Hoop Hole Ridge. So there's a little cemetery there. If you're interested, you want to get a little Meshach Browning experience. There's a little cemetery there, kind of about halfway up that hill if you're going into Oakland. You can pull off there, walk through the cemetery, and then get a nice view of what he's talking about, that view from Hoop Hole Ridge. And you'll see some meadows and most of the southern part of the lake. You're welcome. All right, well, I see food out. Okay, one more question. Then we'll eat.
Up beyond the 4-H camp, at the state park, at that corner, there's a large stone, it's natural stone, they're individual stone, they're huge amount. There's not a cave, but like a protected area back in. It's probably been 30 years since we were there. There's a lot of initials and stuff. You over there?
Who's asking? No, I have been. Yeah, it is. It's part of it is part of like the Rock Lodge Trust, which is kind of a wealthy family from Wheeling. But yes, I have been back there, and I think that was, so Browning describes a lot of these bear hunts and going into bear dens, and that seems to be very likely one of those because that's right off of Meadow Mountain. It has a lot of, not necessarily caves, but things that bears could get into. And probably people, would carve their names and as they were there. So there's a lot of things where you're out there and you can kind of think, hey, this could have been a spot where he was hunting, and this could have been one of those spots from the book. But don't tell anyone I was there.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, everyone.